Jill Sanborn, welcome to the world of Cipher. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
I really wanted to talk to you about the challenges faced by law enforcement when it comes to this incredibly diverse terrorism landscape that you're dealing with today. You served as the executive assistant director for national security at the FBI, and so you understand, I think, better than a lot of people what some of those challenges are, including the fact that a lot of these actors usually communicate via encrypted apps. Sometimes when actors are simply inspired by something but not given direct attention or direct directions, it's really difficult to find those people. Talk to me about some of those challenges and how the FBI tries to approach them.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned a really good point in the beginning, which is diverse. And I think that's one of the things that makes this threat so complicated is the international counterterrorism threat is really more diverse and complex than it's ever been. And a lot of the diversity comes from a lot more ideologies than we used to deal with and a lot of blending of those ideologies. Another thing that makes it really challenging is the complexity, which means traditional ways that maybe they used to communicate. They're doing different things now. So now, for example, they're using encrypted chats. They're maybe using cryptocurrency instead of traditional payment methods. So when we used to follow money, maybe that's a little bit more complex now because of using things like cryptocurrency. They're using AI. They're using 3D printing and making weapons. So there's a lot of things about the threat that make it more complex than it used to be. There's also a decentralized aspect to the threat, which a lot of that comes from the great success that we had with CT pressure, right? We had a lot of great success in eliminating the CT threat overseas. But what that did is it pushed the leadership out globally into small cells so that they could survive. That just makes it more complex and challenging for the intel community, to include FBI, to try to collect on their intelligence.
And really difficult to kind of root out. We were speaking earlier with Bruce Huffman, who said that, for a long time, it looked as if ISIS was on its last legs. And now, a few years later, it's a very different environment. Talk to us a little bit about some of the challenges from a law enforcement perspective when it comes to, I guess, just addressing the real core threat here, not just detecting individual attacks, which you're expected to do, whether
Yeah.
you're resourced for it or not. But overall, like, how are you thinking about this?
Yeah, I think, for law enforcement, rightfully so, since post 9/11, the mentality has been detection and prevention, right? This isn't a traditional law enforcement problem where you hold the individual accountable after the act happens. This is a different law enforcement problem in that there's an expectation that we detect and we prevent, and that's difficult. And what makes it difficult is having the right authorities and the right collection tools so that you can get indicators and warnings that somebody is radicalizing and maybe mobilizing. And as we saw with the events in New Orleans, the most complicated threat when you think about counterterrorism is the lone offender and that homegrown violent extremist. And why it's most complicated and probably the hardest for law enforcement and the intelligence community is, where do you find those indicators and warnings, right? You have much less dots to connect when you have somebody who, in a very insular manner, can become radicalized and mobilized from their own home without any indicators and warnings. So it's very challenging. It's a no-fail mission, right? Like, the expectation is you detect and prevent, not hold them accountable after the fact.
Yeah. And it seems like the environment has changed so much just in the last decade. And a lot of the groups were, using magazines to reach out. They're really doing a lot of social engineering as well to sort of go after these recruits and people, particularly in the United States, who might be struggling, might be having problems. And those lone wolves were really, really difficult to find. Is that still the case? And do you see any possibility of making something like that easier?
No, I mean, 100%. I think probably the things that law enforcement and the intelligence community need the most when it comes to sort of that insular, homegrown, violent extremist, lone offender threat is for that added, statement, see something, say something. What we have found is when you go back and you look at an attack and you sort of dissect all the things that happened leading up to the attack, you do a timeline, you interview family, you look at social media, almost every single time somebody close to the individual knew something was happening, something was changing about it. They call it the bystander effect, I believe. And NCTC and DHS and FBI done great in sort of putting out those things that people should look for as far as behavior changes. But you really do need the community and for people to look for signs that somebody's normal is changing and maybe they're radicalizing and mobilizing, or you won't be able to get inside sort of that insular lone offender threat.
You know, after 9/11 happened, the FBI really changed dramatically in terms of its overseas footprint and how much of FBI's attention and focus was overseas in areas where a lot of these terrorist attacks may be being planned. How do you see that changing in 2025 or the years ahead?
I think it's incredibly important. I mean, I spent a vast majority of my time on what Director Mueller stood up back then, which was the counterterrorism fly team to deploy all over the world to try to be ahead of the threat. I think when you think about the international threat, the more we can do work overseas across the ocean before it emanates here in the United States, the safer we're going to be. And so I think it's incredibly important. But going into 2025, that landscape has changed too, right? We don't have the same international footprint that maybe we had in 2002 and 2004. And so we really need to leverage maybe a more creative way, a more partner way, and rely on our international partners to do some of that eyes and ears overseas versus our physical presence.
Yeah, that's always been something that people who study terrorism have said all along, that those allies and partnerships are so critical for information sharing purposes. That some of those avenues that were in existence 20 years ago, for example, between the United States and Russia, when it came to sharing information on terrorism, at least, that was one part of that relationship that some people considered actually pretty solid. But it's a very different world now. How much does the whole changing dynamic of the global environment concern you when it comes to being able to detect some of these terrorism? Are we just creating an opportunity for more terrorists?
I do think the terrorists are swimming in sort of the chaos that the world is in right now, right? Like all these different events that are happening, relationships among countries who used to be allies that are now maybe adversaries. Terrorists look for places where they have A, opportunity, and B, fractures. And so the more the world gives them to edge their way into those fractures and opportunities, makes it harder for those of us that are trying to detect and prevent. So 100% all the things that are going on in the world are giving them an opportunity to seize on a fracture in a relationship and a potential opportunity.
Yeah. It seems like we see these things in the headlines. I'm sure like the recent ISIS, they think inspired attack in New Orleans. And it goes away after a couple of weeks. It's replaced with some other dramatic headline. But it's hard for people really to remember perhaps how often these things are happening. There aren't always a lot of victims associated with these efforts, but I remember talking to folks in New York City after 9/11 about the fact that they were still stopping a whole lot of attacks that they couldn't talk about to try and protect their sources and methods. Do you think that's still the case?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I would imagine for every couple that you read in the paper, there's a lot more that you don't read about that were disrupted and prevented, thankfully before something bad happened. Those just don't make the headlines. Obviously, these other events do make the headlines. And to your point, sometimes they don't make the headlines because you're intentionally protecting sources and methods. So in
Yeah.
order for us to be as agile as we need to be, we need to try to protect as much of that, how we got to where we got to prevent something as possible.
Yeah, if I asked you to sort of put on the predictive glasses here, and you were looking forward to 2025, given the environment we're in, given the challenges to law enforcement, what do you see kind of happening on the terrorism front in the future?
Yeah, I think it's a more complex terrorism landscape than maybe it's been in the past 10 years. And I say that for a couple reasons. We touched on them a little bit, but what we didn't touch upon is the complexity of the threat in and of itself, but at a time where the US government and other governments are having to focus on so many other things going on. Director Mueller used a term called urgency when he was talking about why terrorism needed to be the Bureau's #1 priority,
Mhm.
post 9/11. I had the luxury of going my whole career with almost terrorism being the only thing that was urgent. And I think today's world, we have a lot of threats that are urgent. And so resources are scarce. We have a counterintelligence threat, cyber threat, violent crime problem. And so I think trying to divide the resources across those threats is difficult. Add in the complexity of the CT threat has changed. We don't have the collection we used to in places where we used to have it. We have people that have come into the country, post the withdrawal in Afghanistan that we're not exactly sure who all came in. You know, vetting is only as good as the collection you have going into vetting. And so I think there's a lot of different things going on. Add in what you brought up earlier about all these world events and fractures in allied relationships. So I think the threat has evolved quite a bit, and probably for the first time in the last 10 years for me, I'm as worried about sort of a directed or coordinated attack as I would be sort of the homegrown violent extremist threat.
Talk to me a little bit about that, because the big fear is there will be another 9/11, of course, here in the US. And with the strengthening, particularly what's happening in Syria right now, and not really understanding the direction of that government or how that's going to evolve exactly.
Yeah.
Talk to me about that fear.
Yeah, I think, we saw it with some of the overseas attacks. So the attack in Russia, right? Prevention of attacks like the concert where we prevented a potential attack from happening. And so
Mhm.
I think for the first time, we're sort of seeing, probably because of those safe havens developing around the globe, we're seeing more communication between potential bad actors and a terrorist organization, where instead of it just being an inspired threat, it could potentially be a directed or coordinated event. And those are things that I think are really challenging for the intelligence community and law enforcement to get into. They have to have the right A, collection, and B, authorities to capture on those indicators and warnings to be able to get ahead of that.
So when you see one of these headlines come across your screen, and unfortunately there have been multiple headlines of people using vehicles and driving into crowds and horrific things like this, what's the first thing you think about from the law enforcement perspective?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing you think about is the victims, right? And the actual attack itself, and how sad it is to have something like that happen. But I think sometimes we get caught up in comparing something like that to a spectacular attack like 9/11. And I think sometimes we forget that even a vehicle ramming where the loss of life is in the dozens, from a country standpoint and a intelligence or a law enforcement officer, like, did we fail here standpoint, it's the same, right? It doesn't matter if you lost one life or thousands of life. We want to protect every terrorist attack from happening.
Mhm.
I think the terrorist organizations have realized that the big spectacular attacks take time, cost money, takes a lot of coordination. You have the potential for the planning of it to get out and it to get prevented. Whereas if they just encourage small scale attacks with a vehicle, a knife, wherever you happen to be or reside, at the end, they're getting the same end effect as a big spectacular attack.
Yeah, it definitely, I definitely understand your point there. Do you think there's going to be another 9/11 in your lifetime?
Mm, I hope not. I spent my whole career hoping not. So I hope not, or working hard and hoping not. Like I said, I think those are hard because they require coordination that needs to be compartmentalized and secure, and you hope nobody talks about it, and you're hoping that governments aren't collecting on it, right? There's a lot of things that play against a foreign terrorist organization pursuing that type of attack again, when multiple small scale attacks can be just as effective in their eyes.
Yeah.
And so I think that their playbook has probably moved away from that, because of the complexities and the ability to potentially identify it and disrupt it.
Mhm.
And that would be what I would hope.
So for them to have sort of more exertion of the power that they're trying to exert in these attacks, you're going to see, or you're predicting more of the smaller scale attacks, or more of those attacks that are simply inspired, where there's not a lot of communication.
100%. Or small insular ones, like I think you could see more San Bernardino types where it's a husband and wife, or the Paris attacks where it's relatives. So I think you could see some larger number casualties that they pursue, but
Mhm.
really trying to keep the planning and plotting simple and insular.
Yeah. Jill Sanborn, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us about this today. It's difficult to put your head around all of this. I can't even imagine what it's like from the law enforcement perspective when you think about what we've been seeing. So thank you so much. Pleasure to have you here.
Thanks for having me. Thank you.